Welcome to Galaxy Dungeon. In this video, I'll be analyzing the mini dungeons of Dragon Quest II. It was one of the first JRPGs and follows the gameplay style of the first game in the series. Dragon Quest II is a sequel to Dragon Quest released on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's subtitled Luminaries of the Legendary Line. It came out in January of 1987. It brought a bigger world, bigger dungeons, and more sophisticated game mechanics, and a way higher difficulty level. In this video, I'll be analyzing the game's 11 dungeons. The dungeons of the first game were very simple yet non-linear, so here I'll be analyzing the mini dungeons of Dragon Quest II. They're a little different from the previous installment. Like the first one, the floors are basic, but you can see more of the screen at a time because this one abandoned the first game's continuous use of torches and magic to see. Also now, when you reach a staircase, you automatically go up or down. The first dungeon of this game is the Spring of Bravery. It's a cave dungeon that leads to a spring that replenishes your health and an NPC that will tell you that a person you were looking for has gone to a certain town. Like the dungeons of Dragon Quest I, it's very short but like a maze. However, this dungeon has more treasure. The dungeons of the first game had very little treasure to encourage the player to look around, and this one has unnecessary pieces of treasure all around. This encourages the player to search every corner. The second dungeon is the Lake Cave. It's another cave dungeon, except this one is twice as long and has 2 floors. At the beginning of the game, you'll have to be careful to survive, and will have to use every item you have to the fullest. Luckily, like the Spring of Bravery, there's a lot of simple items to find scattered around. Despite being longer, it's a little repetitive. You search around and find treasure until you find another path leading to the same kind of choice, giving you multiple places to go. And this keeps happening until you find a silver key and get out. Since this is a loot dungeon, your purpose here is to get a silver key that you need to unlock certain doors. After this, there's an underwater pathway that has 2 routes, one leading to an empty island, and one leading to the next landmass you need to go to. In the next part of the game, there's 2 dungeons, the Moonbrook Castle and the Tower of Wind. First of all, the Moonbrook Castle is a ruined dungeon. However, it's a little small for a dungeon. It's on the line between a dungeon and a mini-dungeon. It's more of a place to talk to ghost NPCs that look like fireballs. The player has to find one survivor in the garden, and you need to stand at a certain point to see what the dungeon looks like from the outside. There's also no treasure, except for a couple of empty treasure chests. Then there's the Tower of Wind, which is a lot like all the other dungeons in Dragon Quest I. Many paths that lead to dead ends until you find one that works, except these dungeons have treasure visible from the start, giving the player some more incentives to explore. Also, it makes actual structural sense. And there's one trap you can fall off the walls. However, this dungeon is very narrow. All floors are the same width. Luckily, it's tall as there are 8 floors. The purpose of coming here is to get the Cloak of Wind, which you need to get any further in the game. There's some treasure, and if you thoroughly explore, you can reach the top floor. That has a prize, an empty chest. Luckily, in the Game Boy remake, there's a wizard's ring instead. Also, there are 4 separate staircases to choose from, and all 4 lead nowhere. But you can tell just by checking one of them. Then there's 2 towers you need to climb just so you can glide off of them. Collectively, they're called the Dragon's Horn. They're 2 towers infested with monsters. However, they have no treasure and are straightforward. But you can still fall off of the first one. Shortly afterwards, you get a boat to traverse the world, and more dungeons open up to you. If you go to Alefgard, there are only 2 dungeons from the original game, the Swamp Cave and the Dragon Lord's Castle. However, the Swamp Cave is nothing but a short tunnel, and the Dragon Lord's Castle is much shorter than the original. The Dragon Lord's Castle still has a few floors and Edric's sword. At the bottom, it looks the same as the original. Also, if you have the golden key, you can get all the treasure. Also, the monsters aren't as hard as the original game, but at this point, they're pretty difficult. It's also more linear than some of the dungeons in this game. There's only one section where you have to choose which direction to go. One will take you to a lower level, and one will take you to Edric's sword. Also, at the end, the laser grid from the first game is used to keep you from getting to the Dragon Lord's grandson's belongings. However, you can get past it. The next dungeon is one directly south of Alefgard, the Lighthouse. This one is way bigger than the last few dungeons. It's also very non-linear and hard to figure out. It's intense and full of sections that you can't see because they're covered in bars. Plus, there are 4 intricate staircases. 2 of them lead to the same area that doesn't get very far or have any treasure, and 2 of them lead to treasure and require the player to search a big part of the upper dungeon. Also, this dungeon makes more sense structurally than some of the previous dungeons I've explored up to this point. Also, there are some doors that you need a silver key to unlock. The monsters are extremely hard to deal with and require a lot of strategy to beat. Also, there are 5 treasure chests in this dungeon, and this gives the player a major incentive to explore. You have to follow a gremlin that disguises itself as an old man, and he'll lead you into a trap. If you survive, you can get a star crest, which is the most important item in the whole dungeon. If you run, then you'll lose it. At the end, there's an NPC that will tell you where you need to go to beat the game. Overall, this dungeon has one path that takes you to another section of the dungeon. Like most of these dungeons, while one leads to a bunch of dead ends, the rest of the dungeon has multiple different pathways and treasure scattered throughout. But it's executed much better than before. Also, it's a tower dungeon. Most tower dungeons are extremely narrow, but this one isn't. It's just right and keeps the high floor count advantage that tower dungeons have. There's one more tower dungeon where you can find another crest, the Moon Tower. It's pretty much the same as the last one, except it's smaller. The player has multiple different rooms to go to at once, and multiple different staircases to take. Also, like the Tower of Wind, the final floor has an empty chest. The monsters are pretty tough, but the monsters aren't very different from the rest of them. The next dungeon is the Sea Cave. It's one that takes up an entire island. It's a large volcanic cave. JRPGs are known to frequently have volcano dungeons, so technically this is the first of that type. Your purpose in coming here is to get the Eye of Malroth, an idol of the game's final boss, which you need to enter the hidden area of Ryon. It's extremely intense. There are a bunch of different staircases to choose from. It also has booby-trapped treasure chests and lava everywhere, which will hurt to run across. The monsters are also very tough, like the last few dungeons. Also, like the Lighthouse, at the end you will encounter monsters that appear to be NPCs first, and then attack you, and you have to find your way out. Hopefully, you'll have enough magic points to use a teleportation spell to get outside. Like a lot of these dungeons, the treasure is scattered to encourage exploration, and it has many different staircases, but many of them lead to the same place. Overall, this is an extremely complex dungeon. The next dungeon is even harder. It's called the Cave to Ryon, also known as the Cave to Renderok. It's the largest dungeon in the entire game, and leads to the most dangerous section of the game. The monsters are even more dangerous than the last few, but it's much bigger. Just a few encounters and you'll be lucky to survive. And the dungeon is extremely hard to get through. This is a cave dungeon, where the purpose is to get into the plateau of Ryon, so it leads upwards. It has a lot of dead ends, traps, and optional treasure. It has potholes that make the player fall into basements infested with grotesque monsters. Plus, there are pathways that cause the player to go around in circles in infinite loops until they find another way around. However, you can't beat the game until you find an optional piece of treasure that can only be reached by falling in a certain pothole in a trap basement. Plus, there's a Thunder Sword and Edric's armor, which are some of the most powerful swords and armor in the whole game. At the end, there's even more puzzle pathways that loop around in circles. You need to keep trying until you guess correctly and make it to the exit. Looking back, this dungeon has only one path to make it to the end, and there are a bunch of incentives to explore and complex pathways with traps and puzzles. but the overwhelming random encounters don't do this dungeon a favor. This actually works out well since it's a cave dungeon. However, the original version didn't look that good on NES graphics, which makes it not as fun. It actually doesn't look as good as some of the previous dungeons. The final dungeon is Hargon's Castle. It requires the player to use the castle's alcoves to discover doors to a higher level. Most of the dungeon is extremely linear, but one section has a puzzle where the player has to enter a certain room a certain way, and then walk into another room the same way, or they can't enter. Then you reach a higher floor. The dungeon has some set encounters with high-ranking, more powerful monsters, and it has the final boss battle at the end. After looking at them, all of these dungeons can be described as large and maze-like. They have treasure scattered way better than the first game, and they're way bigger than the first game. Plus, they have more floors and are more fun to explore than the ones in the previous game. But they're a little inconsistent. Some of them are very linear, and some of them could be considered mini-dungeons. Most of these dungeons are labyrinth dungeons, where the purpose is to find an important item needed to progress. So, this makes them loot dungeons. Thanks for watching. And if there's a JRPG video game that you would like to see a video analyzing the dungeons, please comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a wonderful day.